And again, welcome everyone. Again, I am Jason Christopher. I am the Director of Cyber Risk here at Dragos. And welcome to today's webinar, Regulatory Developments in the Oil and Gas Pipeline Industry, Digital Transformation and OT Cybersecurity Best Practices. Is a fireside chat, which I think are always great because it's not sort of a death by PowerPoint conversation. We're actually going to be able to have dialogue back and forth, make this a little bit lively for everyone. And I'd like to first start off by introducing our panelists today. Again, I'm your moderator here at Dragos, but I'm also joined by another Dragos employee, Mike Hoffman, Principal Industrial Consultant here. And Mike comes from a very rich background of actually being an asset owner who has dealt with a lot of the security standards that we implement across the different spaces here in critical infrastructure. As an oil and natural gas pipeline expert, he brings a lot of good flavor to the conversation that we're going to have in a moment. Mike, welcome, and please tell us a little bit more about your background and what you'll be talking about today.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jason. So as Jason just mentioned, so my role here in Dragos is Principal Industrial Consultant, but I've had a little bit over 20 years of experience actually within predominantly the oil and gas sector, largely doing instrumentation, automation, leading up into cybersecurity, and then exiting a global role in cybersecurity at a larger oil and gas company. In that time, though, I did have the opportunity to work across a number of different sectors, or of course, downstream, midstream, and upstream, and supporting midstream and product movement. And so being able to look at this, look at these systems from an automation perspective and also that cyber perspective, and how to implement the regulations around it. So that's my background. What do I do with Dragos as well as support these efforts? So looking at these standards, helping asset owners and operators do assessments in pipelines, try to meet the formal regulation. Now we're moving into the ST2C regulation or requirements. So that's part of what I do, and I'll turn back over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much. And also joined by Samara Moore. So Samara Moore is a security assurance energy specialist at Amazon Web Services. Samara also has a rich background, not only as an asset owner, but also helping us out across industry and government, creating some of the standards that we've actually led into the development of things like TS Security Directive 2 that we'll be talking about today. Samara, welcome to the panel. And please tell us a little bit more about your background and your roles at Amazon.
Well, thank you. And I'm excited to be here and participating in this webinar. So as you alluded to, my background has been sort of a windy path, going from security operations and then policy, and really helping to shape and form some of our critical infrastructure policies that we have in our nation today. And so that's been really cool. But then also getting, after my time in government, getting a chance to work with an asset owner and operator, and then really get to apply those very same policies and ideas that we had and get to see what it means in practice. So today, for the last about 3.5 years, I've been working at Amazon Web Services, really focusing on ways to securely and in a compliant manner leverage the cloud for even the most critical of functions or workloads. And again, that's keeping in mind the fact that it has to be operationally, safe and make sense from that perspective, but really looking at leveraging new technology to provide increased security and resilience. So I'm happy to be here representing and engaging in the energy sector, but we also focus on multiple other sectors that have dependencies on the energy sector to address these same challenges.
I like that you started off with the conversation and you wove it in there about safety. That's obviously one of the things that we're going to be driving towards a lot on the conversation here today. How does cybersecurity sort of lead towards a safety conversation? Because we have to have safe and reliable operations across our asset owners. So I want to thank both of you. Now, for me, I don't even know what to say for my bio, except that I've known both of these awesome people for multiple years across different jobs. I feel like I'm the luckiest moderator in the world right now because we can have natural conversations really based off of the experiences that I've shared with both of these individuals across my roles, both in industry and in government, but also even leading into most recently some of the roles that I've had within the SANS Institute as an instructor. So balancing all of those together to be able to hopefully bring something unique to the people who are watching today, something that we can talk through regulations and requirements in a way that's not going to be boring. which I think is always a challenge, right? People like think regulations and compliance and like they start like their eyes start rolling in the back of their head. They maybe slope down a little bit, but I know that the people that we have today to talk through this are going to really keep it not only from a perspective of how to talk through the challenges, but also what should be the actionable guidance that you should do next. All three of us have really focused on how do I take something that's esoteric and academic or regulatory in nature and make it applicable, do something with it. And so with that, I want to be able to just sort of level set. For folks that aren't familiar with what's been taking place, it has been a wild ride across the pipeline industry recently. Starting off with obviously the conversation that really took to the airwaves and has been on across the headlines on May 7th of 2021 of last year, the Colonial Pipeline incident, where there was a ransomware attack that impacted the IT infrastructure, but also then understanding that IT and OT have dependencies across each other, and Colonial Pipeline actually being very vocal, I think, to really a good part for the industry to be able to see what you would do during an incident to tell people what's going on, understanding that there was a controlled shutdown in that case. So it wasn't ransomware in the OT, but an understanding that having an incident like that could obviously impact operations. And shortly after that, 20 days later, the TSA issued its first set of sort of security directives that led into then the July of 2021 timeframe too. There were some original, let's just call them friction points, I would say, over those requirements, because they were relatively prescriptive in some of the things they wanted asset owners to pursue. And some of them were a little bit difficult in the OT environment for you to truly say, can I do this thing? Which led us into this new revision, the things that we're going to talk about today, where it's not as prescriptive. It's actually, I'd say, more planful in how it is that you would address things inside your operations, allowing you flexibility, which is one of the things that is really unique from, I think, the IT space to the OT space. The amount of flexibility you need to be able to address things that will happen uniquely in your environment is something that got introduced earlier this year. And those regulations are something that we're now having to deal with. How do I be planful? First, you told me what to do very prescriptively. Now you're asking me to do strategic planning for my security program. So not as prescriptive, more flexibility, but those are two different skill sets. Tell me what to do or tell me how to plan are two rapidly different things. And that's what we're going to uncover over the course of this webinar. So I want to talk about those plans in particular, just outline them as we get into our questions with the panelists. The very first plan that you need to have is some sort of cybersecurity implementation plan. What do you do in OT to be able to identify your critical cyber systems, have specific requirements for network segmentation, right? Keeping that IT and the OT traffic system separated. Implementation of access control, both local and remote access, which is obviously an increasing concern, especially in post-COVID times. The use of continuing monitoring of what's happening inside your environment. Like I like to think about this one as the tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. If I'm not monitoring and an attacker is in my environment, how would I know? And so being able to have that conversation about visibility, and then our good old friend, patch management in the OT. There's a lot of conversations about vulnerabilities and patch management and how do you prioritize those. And we're undoubtedly going to dive into that over the next course of this webinar. The next two plans, a little bit different in nature. Now we have an implementation plan. What do we do when things go wrong? That would be your incident response plan. And then I also think really creatively, as we dive into it, will be the assessment plan. How do I double check that I'm doing what I say I should be doing? And how do I assess my security controls as a response to that? So we'll dive into questions on all of these, but I want to level set for the audience why it is that we're here and what are the things in the new security directive that you need to be aware of. And the last thing that you should be aware of is the timeline. We wanted to have this webinar now because for most folks, you're right in the middle of it. You have until October 25th, so a few weeks away from when we are doing this webinar, to have a draft implementation plan that you're sending to the TSA. They'll then approve that plan as we get into the early parts of 2023, and then you're off to the races. So you're doing your assessment plan, and then you have an entire continuous cycle of what you're doing to assess and implement those plans, and then be able to provide those updates to your regulator. So if you're not familiar with the sort of timeline of events, don't worry, you've got at least a couple of weeks to now get hip with it. And we should hopefully be able to provide you with some of that context as part of that as well. And so with that, I will go ahead and bring us into a delightful discussion, I hope, across all of these topics. And I first want to start off with really, for both Mike and Samara, as you look at the new security directive, what do you like about it? What do you not like about it? I mean, this has been a change of pace now. We sort of shifted from something that was very prescriptive, and we've seen prescriptive regulations in the past. We've seen what that looks like across multiple critical infrastructures. And we've also seen sort of more flexible ways of dealing with security, whether it be things that have come out, for example, with the NIST cybersecurity framework, where we have objectives that we want to reach, not necessarily how to reach those objectives. So I'll start off with Samara, just basically because I just referenced the NIST cybersecurity framework. With your history on that, what has been your perspective on being able to have that shift? And again, what are the things about this new directive that you like or don't like?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I really want to recognize to start is the partnership between industry with TSA and with CISA. And I think this is a really good example of listening to industry and adjusting, right? And so that's one thing that I absolutely like about it, and encourage that continued partnership as we go on this cyber journey, right, for critical infrastructure. The other thing that I like, though, is the flexibility that is provided to be able to manage the cyber risk and the security objectives in a manner that's consistent with the OT environment that is in place. And so the alignment with frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework, it makes that very, very doable, and particularly because it references to different resources that entities can use to achieve that alignment. I think the other thing that I like is that there's increased transparency. So that really helps to eliminate some of the confusion that we heard from customers who weren't quite sure how to apply it, if they were leveraging our services, and in particular, they couldn't tell us much. So that became a challenge. But as I said earlier, very quickly, I think that was addressed when raised, and I want to commend the government agencies for doing that. So that's what I'll call out for now.
And
Yeah,
I would
if you don't
just
mind,
say,
go ahead.
no, the only thing I was going to say is that as a former regulator, to see a regulatory agency change gears and listen to industry is amazing. Like that is absolutely, I think, a success story for industry and government in this, is understanding that, yes, there were some initial missteps and then course correcting. That gives hope to the entire process. So sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just had like the old regulator in me and my ex auditory days. I was like, oh yeah, that was amazing. That was great.
Yeah, exactly. Well, one of the things that, first of all, it's open. So we as, a company that can help other people as well, can actually look at it and reference it and be able to help. So having something that, having a directive that is open to the public, they can look at it, review it. It enables the owners and operators to get the support and the help that they often need and are asking for. Again, coming back to the other one, so really, I think a lot of this conversation is around the differences between the 2B and the 2C directive, and so what's changed in there, what's flipped. A lot of it, like you're saying, it's not. So we're really looking at, it's not a prescriptive. So a lot of the security controls that were really called out were, you kind of scratch your head. It's like, is this for IT or is this for OT? Like multi-factor authentication on my endpoint devices and like PLCs and RTUs, how is that going to work? A lot of that has kind of gone away. And again, that's coming from that feedback, I think, that TSA has listened to the owners and operators and received that feedback. So that there's a lot of things where it's greatly improved. I think, though, when we see something that is more, like you said, outcome-based or performance-based, it really takes that, it's instead of somebody just looking at a checklist of what I need to go do next, now it's like, well, what should I go do? What kind of controls should I use? Because within the wording of SD2C, and I may be kind of jumping the gun here, but in the wording of it, you kind of almost have to understand a little bit of what's behind that word, because there's some definite, there's a direction coming. And I think you can't read the newer standard just verbatim. You kind of need to understand what's behind it and reference the other, like cybersecurity framework and other ones to be able to understand, the nature of the language. So nevertheless, there's a lot of good things called out in it. One of the things that I have found though that there's still some carryover there, some language in it that it still feels a little bit, some of the first part of the controls feel a little bit IT-ish like. It's like, is this still for on the business side? I'm not quite sure, but nevertheless, it's definitely moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it's funny because that carryover, I recognize that too. And part of the thing I thought was interesting about it was, in the recognition of, hey, let's shift gears to get to these plans that you can implement. There was language that's basically like, well, if you use the old stuff and you still want to use it, still do. If you use multi-factor, if all of a sudden you went through and you decided, oh yeah, I'm gonna have all my operators take a PIV card and plug it into a keyboard as we go. If you did all that, keep it if you want. I thought that was an interesting sort of really cutting the baby in half and saying, yeah, we probably just moved the needle for a lot of organizations in a very quick period of time, right? The implementation for what we did in 2B was very aggressive across the board of being able to get something in place. So if you already got those things in place, continue on. And so you're right. I think some of those controls you're going to see sort of continue to pop up in their own, I don't want to say problem areas, but maybe some friction that OT and IT still need to talk through things as we deal with more convergence across those boundaries. Excellent. Well, so why don't we dive into those plans? So as you both mentioned, those plans are a little bit more flexible in base. And so when I read through the implementation plan, I actually thought that it gave this logical flow of things that you'd want to be able to see. You say, what are the crown jewels? What are the critical assets I really care about? Okay, let's lock down the perimeter around those things. Who has access and how are they accessing things, either locally or remotely? And can we monitor things for when stuff goes wrong and then try to get some basic hygiene in place? Do you, as sort of the things that you've started off with, and I'll start with you, Mike, do you find those steps to be adequate? Are there sort of pitfalls that asset owners and operators should look for when they're implementing the requirements? It seemed like you already teased a few of those out. So why don't we just pull that thread a little bit further and explore that?
Yeah, I do. And that's why I was talking a little bit about, you kind of need to pull the thread on the language a little bit. So where it says go do this, look for, have logs in place, look for know your connections and those kind of things. You could take these different objectives and kind of go one way or the other. You could say, okay, today I'm going to go have a look at my drawings. I'm going to go identify some communications and boom, I'm good to go. Or you could take that as, well, I'm going to go put in a continuous monitoring solution in this location, so I can know my network traffic and I can know my ports and protocols and services running. So you can, a lot of these you can take these in multiple different ways, and I think that's where some of the challenge will be is where people will read into these and take it one direction or another. But I think in general where it's going is very, very good. It's just to at what extent they're carried out, some of the performance objectives, and I think that's why TSA probably put in that requirement to review your plan. So once you create the plan, they want to review it.
Can you show it to me, please?
Yeah. So.
Awesome. How about you, Samara? So what are the things that you've seen maybe from that flow? Because I do think that flow actually does really similarly look at some of the other standards that we've examined in the past. Are those steps really adequate, or are there other things that you would want to be able to highlight as, hey, this is a potential pitfall that you should examine as you implement a certain control or a certain topic?
Yeah, I think that flow is a good way to start. And depending on where you are in the maturity of these types of controls, some of those things may be very straightforward, or you may be very, basic and initial. And so what I would recommend, and I think a pitfall would be going through a process of set it and forget it, but really having that culture of continuous improvement, and then looking for opportunities to grow in maturity over time. I think another thing that I'll call out, and as I was looking at it, kind of putting the hat that I wear right now as a service provider, is really thinking about understanding, not just understanding your assets and your critical functions, but understanding the degree in which you're relying on other key partners, whether it's internal or external partners to help perform that, and then figuring out how can you get assurance, again, whether it's an internal partner or external partner, that those controls that you're expecting to be in place are in place. And so I know we've been asked by customers in the industry to get those third-party independent assessments that can help demonstrate not just that we say, hey, we're a great partner, we're doing great things, but where they can actually have some independent validation. And I would encourage pulling the thread a bit. I think we kind of use that analogy already to have some assurance that your partners that you're working with are also, implementing or managing the controls that either you depend upon them or you believe you're inheriting from them. So there's a couple of certifications that we recently got this year, Cyber GRX and Cyber VATIS, sorry, that really help give that independent verification.
That's actually a really great point. It's not just the asset owners themselves. When we think about cyber risk, there's this idea that I've got a certain amount of risk as an asset owner, but you inherit the risk of your suppliers and your vendors and your partners in this space as well. And if you're not familiar with what their risks are or how secure they are, then you may be inheriting risk that you don't even know about. It could be, something that's actually quite bad if you're not aware and asking those questions. And we've seen the same thing on the Drago site too. I'd say the plethora of questionnaires now that we get as part of supply chain risk management. I know for most vendors, it's not unique, but it's great actually it's great. And it's also, obviously, it's got its own pain points. It's great because people are asking the question, right? And if you weren't asking the question before, you were just accepting risk that you had no idea you were accepting. Now, by at least asking the right questions, you're pushing that forward. And I think that's a great sort of discussion point to be able to explore as well. So and actually I'll do a skip and a jump to get us to IR, because one of the things that we see with suppliers is obviously there have been some incidents in the past that have impacted suppliers, that have sort of percolated into either the IT network or the OT network, things that have happened recently, like SolarWinds, for example, which leads us to a conversation about incident response. Asset owners and incident response, it's a difficult thing, especially when thinking about OT. There are countless times that we'll go and talk to an organization and say, oh yeah, we have an incident response plan, and it's an IT incident response plan. Or the OT part is have Bob and Alice, the engineers, call the SOC, and the SOC will do what SOC magic is. And they may not have that idea of IT and OT collaborating, right? Maybe IT has to worry about forensics on the human machine interface. Do they know how to enter a plant? Do they know how to work through these things? But at some point, IT has to step away, and the OT folks have to say, all right, we're ready for a plant restart. We are the ones who are operating the plant, not IT. And it's a very different mantra. And so seeing this IR plan now as the second part of the new plans that you need to have in place, get called out is, I think, really great. And Samar, one of the things that I'm actually reminded of is I'm going to harken back to over a decade now, but when first going through C2M2, and talking to, so for cybersecurity capability maturity model, for those who aren't nerdy about this, when going through that model, a good 1/6 of all the practices was dedicated to incident response. And we know that the maturity there is a little bit difficult. Where do you see this going with oil and gas pipelines in particular? What would be the things that you would sort of have them explore a little bit more, based off of not only going through and creating the guidance that most folks use, but also implementing it for yourself?
Well, there's a few things I call out. One, and we can't, I think, overstate this. Know who is doing what to support your critical functions and involve them in the response planning and exercise activities. And, that helps. It goes a long way in, making sure that they understand their responsibilities and what's expected of them in the moment, and the ability to apply that to a use case. So if I go back to my last job where we regularly did exercises, we always had lessons learned. We always improved our processes by going through these exercises, and the more key stakeholders that we involved, the better our planning was. If I'd say again, I'll put on my service provider hat, it's really, again, important to understand who your third-party vendors or providers are and the role that they would play in response. Oftentimes we hear, talked about shared responsibility and what's inherited. When it gets down to certain use cases, make sure you understand who to call, that on the other end, that they're lined up to support you in that way. And so involving them in your drills and exercises where possible and practical is really helpful. So either one, shore up maybe a gap that either party didn't realize, or just validate that you're in a good place.
I like that whole, hey, bring them on ahead of time. The phrase that I'll use there is, you don't want to be making introductions during your incident response, right? Like,
No,
oh,
you do
hey,
not.
I'm Jason. I'm your IR specialist for today. How you doing? And I'll also just say that the easiest way that I've always found to get folks to the table, as it were, during a tabletop, pizza, donuts, feed them, and they'll come. But definitely, I agree with that. Being able to have them at the exercise is absolutely important, so they know what they're doing and why. Mike, not only have you gone through incident response, but you also teach incident response. You go through and teach people how to go and survive that bad day in OT. What about you? When you looked at that sort of part of the plan, what was the thing that jumped out at you, either from your own experience or from the experience of the students that you even had over your career, that you said, oh, this is going to be either painful or delightful, depending on if they do X?
Yeah, a couple of aspects that I saw that was delightful was a mention of forensics, and they even mentioned like memory forensics and that kind of stuff. Being able to pull, when something does go bad, be able to identify what's going on, and so pulling memory forensics, understanding how you're going to do containment. So they're actually calling this out in this plan here, and I thought that was fantastic, because a lot of times the detail on a lot of these directives and so forth will go to a certain level. But I think this one's really trying to hearken on where the data is that you need, the timely information for that incident response. A couple of things, though, that I found that maybe jumped out that wasn't quite covered, and again, I wasn't really expecting it to be, but around retainers. So a lot of times where you have a response type effort, you may, within your company, you may develop a response plan, and you may build up some of these capabilities. But a lot of times, and we're finding more and more, is companies are looking for, some specialists to come in and support that response effort. So having a retainer in place, but kind of like you were saying, you don't leverage that retainer or try to figure out who's on the other end only during an incident. You got to figure out, you got to know those people. So when something does happen, it's a casual, it's that conversation of, I think this is going on. We'd like to spin up this retainer, knowing the SLAs for it, when people can come on site, what they're going to find, and in Dragos and a couple of SANS white papers talk about the collection management framework, being able to once you show up on site, know what data you're collecting, and where can we begin to go help you with this, identify where the adversary could potentially be, help in that containment effort, and so forth. I think Samara brought up another fantastic point, is the vendors, though, and relying on those third parties as well. And that comes back into a recovery discussion. And a lot of times, and I've actually been in a couple tabletops where the client, and even the formal company used to work in, a lot of focus and also reliance on vendors for restoration. So thinking that they have the backups, they'll be able to come in and restore their systems. And I've actually been on a couple of tabletops where you actually pick up the phone call, or you make that call to the vendor and say, okay, running a tabletop right now, my DCS or SCADA system is offline, part of the scenario. Can you come restore the system? And do you have the latest backups? And when can you actually get this done? And so a lot of times we found that it's kind of silence on the other end. Like, yeah, we pulled the backups a year ago, maybe. And I have no idea if we can restore those systems. And so again, having these relationships in place, and then testing those relationships out, testing those capabilities that's been documented, you're paying for probably, but actually testing those out as you're going through these scenarios is extremely important, and just something that we need to be thinking about as we look at these IR plans.
It's a great point. And again, I think it even goes back to this whole conversation of, you don't want to have these awkward conversations during the incident, right? It's about being planful. And so it's really great to see that plan there ahead of time. So for the audience, I will say we do have the Q&A button. So as I asked this last question about our last plan, I'd love to be able to get some audience questions as well. So feel free, if we don't answer them live, don't worry, we'll be able to type them offline, or we'll be able to follow up with an email to the audience after the fact. So I want to make sure that we keep on track though, and get to the last plan that we have in here, which I think is interesting, because again, it's this idea of assessment plan. Who watches the watchman almost? How are you going to make sure that the governance you put in place with the first one, the incident response plan that you put in place, is actually assessed to do what you think it's going to do. So Mike, I'll start with you because I know that you did a lot of VADRs over the past year with clients who were going through the very first edition of this. And I guess VADRs are dead, long-lived VADRs. We're now into CADRs. So we're now switching the terminology, but we still have the same sort of idea of doing some sort of architecture review, right? Some sort of process to understand how our topology works, how our systems work, and maybe what vulnerabilities we'd want to be able to explore with that. When you look at the assessment plan, I think the assessment plan is just really unique in general because it's asking you to do even things like purple teaming potentially. Where do you see that sort of happening from a maturity perspective? Like it feels like it's a crawl, walk, run. It feels like you have to be this tall to ride the ride for some of these assessment types. What have you seen when trying to implement different assessments across different asset owners?
Yeah, very much so. And it is interesting because so it used to be in the 2B directive, it was every year you're supposed to do the VADR. And so now we're every 2 years for the CADR, which is essentially about the same thing, but we're pushing out another year. Nevertheless, so really when I've done numerous of these VADRs or assessments, if you will, on the old directive, and it's looking to be pretty similar on the newer one. It's essentially, it's understanding essentially the boundaries areas and the firewall rules, boundaries, communication flows. A lot of the focus on these directives has been that the interdependencies of IT/OT and understanding those cross boundaries of the user to system communication and also system to system communication. So what data flows are going across, maybe for custody transfer data, measurement data, all of those things, question flows and so forth. And so being able to look at your system. So after you've implemented these controls, now you're kind of going in and saying, are those controls working fit for purpose? Do we really understand our systems? And it even calls out an understanding, kind of taking a snapshot of your north-south and east-west communication. Being able to actually have a tool to do that is very, very helpful. You can do it as a kind of once-off approach, but I see a lot of these assessment areas is where tools can help, definitely in some of these areas. Like you were saying, though, is that so part of this is doing this review, and then the other part of it is this assessment, and you almost look at the assessment as almost like an audit. So you're auditing your plan, your implementation plan, and you're assessing your controls. And then also you're doing this pen test or red team, blue team, purple team type of activities. And as you said, the maturity on those things is quite different. But if you take it to the aspect of, if you don't kind of freak out about that, the next, the red teaming or the purple teaming, if you look at it as, so now that we've done this review, we've maybe modified or changed some of our controls around, we've improved them. So now let's assess how well those are working. So maybe we do like a assume breach type pen test where we put, a company with some has OT penetration type capability. We put those within an area within the DMZ or so forth, and give them an account and allow them to try to get down into the OT environment, see if our controls are working. Doing those kind of things and doing it like on an off year between your assessment, you can kind of see where that will really help the maturity. I think though, on a lot of companies, the first time they do this, it may be kind of overwhelming. But yet I see this as it can really bolster the security of their program to do properly. So
it sounds like you're suggesting like, hey, you have to do this every 2 years for the CADR, and on your off years, you should still be doing something. Don't try to front load everything and do like CADR and pen test and all of these in 1 year, and you'll do that every 2-year cycle. But keep a sanity check of just like an even keel load, a base load for this in the electric sector of what that looks like. That's an awesome suggestion. So Samara, for you, because we sort of just ended there with a conversation on like, he used the word like compliance and he used the word audits. And I'm going back to sort of experiences as a former regulated entity. When you think of assessments, I know that they're, especially in compliance, and we're in a regulated discussion right now, it almost becomes like an idea of a checkbox mentality, unfortunately, when we get sort of more jaded with the overall process. What would you suggest to asset owners as they look at their assessment plan that they now need to do, CADR every 2 years? Mike's suggestion of maybe doing something on the off years that sort of complements those things. How would you sort of keep that fresh or really give advice to somebody who's implementing this for the very first time, as many of the asset owners are currently?
Well, first of all, I'm going to plus one what Mike has recommended. I think that's a really good measured approach. What I would add to that is to track those areas of improvement and make it visible to the right stakeholders in the company to drive those changes, right? So doing those reviews is important, right? Validating that you have what you want to have, but there are always recommendations for going to the next level. There's always the opportunities for new investments to perhaps be able to do things more efficiently, more effectively, making sure that those reviews don't necessarily stay hidden, like get them the right visibility. In previous experiences where things have gotten traction and our ability to drive change is when we can take that information, connect it to business impact, and then get business support so that we could not just keep doing what we're doing, but we could do it more efficiently and better in the future. So my recommendation is really more of, okay, let's really be aggressive in a safe and operational way, but aggressive about actually driving positive change in that space.
It's almost like a culture statement, right? Like we're actually trying to tackle the changing behaviors, changing, values and beliefs of what's happening in the cyberspace for the OT folks. I think that's really insightful. And I'll actually continue to pull that thread then. Let's say that you're dropped into utility. I mean, we've all been vendors. We're all vendors now. We've all been asset owners though. Like all of us have shared this experience of actually trying to implement something. And maybe implementation is a little bit more grisly than what the on the paper black and the white looks like. If you were to be dropped into an asset owner and you now have got a few weeks to finish up these implementation plans, you've got an implementation plan, an IR plan, and these assessment plans to do. Samara, starting with you, what would sort of be like your top three things, your top three priorities that you would do if you're like put right in the front of this and said, okay, figure out our TSA SDO2 plan, please.
So I'm airdropped right in.
Right in.
I mean, really getting back to that flow, right? Understanding what am I focusing on? What are my critical assets, including those things that the stack and the technology that's supporting them and those key partners, understanding what those risks are. And then as we're developing those plans, making sure we're testing, there is the incident response plan, we have to develop it anyway, but making sure we're really not taking this as a check the box, not going the extreme and trying to over-engineer it, but working to develop it over time, but trying to use relevant use cases when developing this plan so that it's actually actionable and usable, and then continuing to build and grow as we go.
I like the use cases conversation. It's something that, when you are creating a program, you're like a program designer, and any designer needs to know how users are going to react to things. Otherwise, they're not going to use it. And so use cases that's an amazing, great example of being able to make it based off the persona of who's going to be using it, which will be the operators who maybe up until this point, the most they've been talked to about security has been, hey, don't click on a bad link, don't plug in a USB. But now there's like a whole plan that needs to be unveiled. And so I really like that idea of use cases.
Yeah, just another comment on that. I found that when you can focus it on something specific, the ability to really address not just questions, but get meaningful action and focused action, you shortcut an awful lot because you're focusing on a specific instance that's a real use case for that environment. And that really helps. And of course, then you can just build from there.
And that leads to buy-in, right? So that helps out with, again, the beliefs, the attitudes, the values that maybe they already have. So that's fantastic. Mike, how about you? What would be your top three priorities? You're parachuted in. You now you're at an asset owner. You have to do these three big plans. You have to address the entire program. What would be your top three priorities that you would sort of go through?
Well, I mean, we got three plans, so that's pretty easy for me. You can deal with each one of them. No, honestly, I think with the implementation plan, and I've shared this with some others as well, is treat it like a policy. And there's enough leeway here that you can kind of steer your own path. You can write, you can go the direction that you need to for the company. And that's one of the things I really like about this directive is they give you enough leeway to do the right things. And so look at it as, so, when you identify your most critical systems, those are the systems you need to go focus on. When you identify your interdependencies, understand those and know what happens when you go into that response mode. And then for me, it would be around, how do I make this easy on myself and on my teams? So trying to not tool focused, but automate out as much as I can, because when you go down to those other plans, the assessment plans and so forth, there's going to be a lot of reoccurring tasks that if you have the right tooling in place, it's going to be a lot easier to do this. Now, of course, tools aren't going to fix everything, but they will greatly improve, the performance and the way you go about doing that. So define what you're going to do and what you're not going to do in your implementation plan. Again, just like a policy, identifying the things you're not going to do is almost as important as the things you are going to do. In your response plan, again, identify, and like Samara said, come up with those use cases, and test against those. So we have the great Colonial Pipeline incident. Will your incident response plan be able to deal with that and run with that? And so as you come up with tabletop scenarios and so forth, will your incident response plan be able to handle that? So making sure your incident response plan is in place, communications are there, and so forth. And then, of course, in your implementation plans, just get ready to as you're doing your implementation, making sure that you're collecting that evidence, making sure you're collecting that documentation, and building up the capability to when it comes time to at year one and year 1+ is when you begin to go audit and assess. You already have a lot of the information at hand, and you can kind of ease yourself into it. And it's not just that big rush to go. Make sure you're quote unquote compliant.
Right, everything's on fire moment.
Yeah, exactly. And really use this to, again, gain visibility within your leadership, the things that you do find, and so those kind of things. All these plans really should speak to the good work that you're doing so far, and maybe the things that you need to be focusing on a little bit more, where it may require extra resources, time, money, budget, so forth. Where you can really, really improve your program into where you want it to be. So,
and I would actually marry up to the ideas between both of the panelists right there, is the idea of use cases and the scenarios for your IR really could breathe life into this, right? So being able to talk to the actual people who are there, who are working through this, use Colonial Pipeline as one of those examples if you'd like, but really anything that's like ransomware based, because that's all the rage right now, is one of the top threats that you have to contend with. Look at your architecture, look at what you're doing in that implementation plan. Would your implementation plan help you out during a ransomware incident? Would your IR plan help you out during an incident for ransomware? Or is it just, again, call the SOC? I can't call the SOC. We have voice over IP phones and it's all been ransomware. Like, what are the things that you're able to do and how do you do it is really important. Mike, you had a really, I think, key distinction there that I'd like to pivot over to Samara to ask a question around, and that's the idea of tooling, right? Tooling and automation to make compliance easier. There are a lot of different things that we can do in the space, obviously, both from the Amazon perspective with talking about cloud, from the Dragos perspective, talking about what things we can do for monitoring. But I want to get your thoughts on this idea of automating things that you have to do for compliance as opposed to the highly manual processes, and where those tools can come into play, and maybe we could help people out on how it is that they would address their program.
Yeah, so, I am all on board for automation and leveraging technology. Oftentimes we try to look to see how can we take humans out of the loop and leverage technology to do it for us, and use humans for some of the other tasks. But, with technology, it's important to understand what needs to be done to make sure you actually have the security you think you are going to have. And so regardless of the tooling and technology that you're using, understanding what you're getting and what you need to configure is really, really important. But then there are such capabilities out there and available through tooling and technology now. So many services offer alignment with, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework. And so you can leverage both monitoring templates or even configuration templates that might get you to the 80% point. And then you can tailor to what you need from there. Take advantage of that. Definitely take advantage of that if you have those types of tools. it shouldn't reduce complexity. However, if you're not thoughtful in advance and you're bringing technology and tooling together and not thinking about how these systems are being architected and integrate with each other, it could increase complexity. So really stepping back, of course, security is always simpler and easier if you think about it up front, but trying to build that in as you can, but then take advantage of capabilities that will help you with things like logging, or maybe you can't necessarily automatically prevent everything, but you get quick alerts when things do happen or when things do change. So taking advantage of that is particularly important. If I can speak to a minute to some things that we've done at AWS, is we really have tried to build things like that in. So things like we have conformance packs as an example. And so it takes a collection of config rules, AWS config rules, and related remediation actions that you can deploy as is or tailor to support your environment, or even conformance packs that are tied to the NIST cybersecurity framework that help you, again, get a good bit of the way, and then allows you to focus on whatever tailoring you might need to do within your environment to meet your specific controls. So we have a set of security services, but if you think about other tooling and technology that you're doing, understand the capabilities that they offer you and then use them. It's a great way to help validate what you have in place, but also enable you to quickly respond if need be.
Complexity, I think, is that was the key phrase that I got out of that for sure, because the tooling and how you use the tools, right? So if all you have is a hammer, you see everything as a nail, but understanding how the tools work and building it into your plan is basically what I was hearing there, can help you really not only address what we've just talked about, but it seems like we're also getting closer to this idea of sustaining, right? If we've got the right pieces in place, maybe we can sustain this effort instead of feeling highly manual and highly sort of not getting to the flywheel perspective, but you're constantly pushing a rock up a hill and then it's going to keep on trying to come down. And so why don't I explore that complexity discussion a little bit? Because again, Mike, I'm thinking back towards the assessments that have been done, across the Vaders and what we've done at Dragos, and even being able to automate some of the things with like the Dragos platform to, instead of getting, your network diagram from Y2K where like there's an eraser mark, like, oh no, we moved that printer there about 5 years ago, it's somewhere else now. Where do you see some of the complexity getting eased up by using technologies and understanding how those technologies could be used to benefit not just your security, but also your compliance at the same time?
Yeah, I think one of the things is around the networks and the traffic. So, a lot of times when you talk about, OT architectures and traffic flows and so forth, people will pull up the nice, pretty Purdue model diagram and it shows everything. It's nice and crisp and clean and those kind of things. But you get into some of these SCADA architectures where, especially when we're talking pipeline midstream communications, it's very complicated. The types of systems where you have backup control rooms, and you have different things going across different WAN connections and redundant pathways, and you look at all the routers and firewalls and all those kind of things in between, and then you have to go figure out all the different connections that have been allowed through the firewalls. The complexity level just skyrockets. And trying to, as a security person, come in and say, so this is what should look right. This is some things you need to change. It's very daunting and very challenging without tools. And so when you bring in like a network monitoring platform, like a Dragos platform or something like that, what is actually looking at the network communication, if you place those sensors within the certain choke points, it allows you to see, first of all, what you thought may have been a hardened firewall. Where you thought that some of your access control lists and access control entries were hardened and so forth, but with those tools you can see, yeah, it's not quite there. You can see all these different insecure protocols and wide open ports, and you can see all these traffic flows between IT and OT. All those things you couldn't see before without that visibility. So being able to put a tool in there, not just to create a snapshot, which is like what the directive is saying, hey, you need to at least do a snapshot of your communications, but being able to see it real time, to know that, hey, I know today these 2 points between IT and OT are talking, but those are established. We know about those, and everything else is not talking. It's shut off. It's been blocked by our firewalls and configurations. Being able to put tools in place to tell you the exact state of your network and what is flowing and those kind of things is extremely important. That's one of the reasons why I got so excited about network security monitoring years ago, is because me being a former asset owner operator OT security personnel at a plant and in other environments, one of the biggest worries that I had was I don't really know my network. I don't really understand what systems are talking to other systems. And so to be able to know that is a massive, I mean, I don't know how you could sleep well at night not knowing your network that well. So being able to put these tools in place, know your cross communication flows, know your systems, and understand when something's not right, or you see those weird, traffic and communication starting to pull up, that you're alerted upon that may not be, safe communications or adversaries in your environment. So.
A lot of good points there, and specifically, I guess, around, again, complementing compliance, technology, and security simultaneously. Again, a reminder, and we'll have a few more minutes left, but a reminder to the audience that if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature. We'll be able to answer those again, either by typing them out, we can do a couple of them live, or we'll be able to follow up later. But there is one of the live questions that we had here for Samara, and sort of talking about in your introduction, really leveraging cloud services, and just sort of understanding what are the types of things that you see cloud services being able to do to benefit some of the energy and utility folks, especially when we talk about things like what's in the implementation plan and what we do across the incident response and assessment plans.
Yeah, so for those environments where cloud services can be leveraged because it meets the operational needs of a customer, what cloud can do is help with auditing, not just auditing, I should say, setting those right configurations. So Mike was talking about the data flows and making sure you understand the data flows and the traffic. You can set very specific rules to manage that and restrict that, and then know and be able to easily get reports on what's occurring. Again, it gets to be having things appropriately configured within the cloud. And it allows you to be flexible and try different scenarios and be agile as needed. The configuration. So one of the things that we've really been trying to do is help simplify security in the cloud for customers, so customers better understand that shared responsibility model, both in what they're inheriting and providing that third-party attestation for things that are being inherited, but also really helping to connect the dots where there are capabilities that as a customer they need to manage within the cloud, and then making it simple for them to demonstrate that if they need to for either internal compliance or for external compliance. And so the cloud can help with that. I think the automation of security functions and tasks is also something that's really, really pretty straightforward, either to do with some of the native services and security services available in the cloud, or to configure specifically as you might need it.
Awesome. That's actually, I think it's really insightful because and we've actually debated this a little bit when talking about, cloud and security and OT. It's like there's this Venn diagram of people who know OT security really well, and people who know cloud security really well, and merging that Venn diagram together is like a new skill set that is really great to see sort of get that understanding for asset owners to be able to figure out for themselves where the technology paths sit for them.
Yeah, so, and if just another point on that, I think there are partners who have that merged skill set that are really skilled in OT and have capabilities available via the cloud, right? So it's useful to understand that, and it is great to see more and more in the community coming together to look to see how can you, what use cases make sense, and then how can you securely and resiliently leverage cloud.
Awesome. So we're coming up to the top of the hour. I've got one last question, and I like to be able to end this on both not only a positive note, but also an exploratory note for the panelists to be able to look into the future, look into the crystal ball of what does this look like for asset owners as they mature. When we think about things like regulation, and you'll hear this a lot, especially if you talk to a NERC regulated utility on the electric side, that regulation is the floor, not the ceiling, right? There's a lot more of the space that you can explore. And even though there's a lot of great advancements that we've seen in this new security directive, understanding that there are other things that asset owners may want to be able to do further with. There's a lot of other standards out there, you know, the ISA IEC 62443 standards. We've talked a lot about the NIST cybersecurity framework. Where do you see the future of oil and natural gas pipeline utilities, asset owners and operators going as their next step? So, you know, we show that timeline of like what it looks like 2 years in the future. I'd like to see a crystal ball. So I'll start with Mike, a crystal ball of what does it look like at year 3 to 5 to, if you want to go out to 10, I'll join you on that journey. But where do you see the future lying for these security programs that folks are just now starting on?
You know, for me, if I look out, it's going to be further pulling of these different, like you said, the different standards out there and including them. So we've started out with some pretty basic things to do, fairly high level. And I think, and I hope and think that it'll still go forward with this performance model, but yet continue to pull in more things from the different standards and really kind of explore some of the areas. You know, we've you know, the new directive just, you know, talks about, you know, grab some logs, view the logs. Doesn't talk about, you know, the total SIM aggregation, doesn't talk about ITOT teams, all those kind of things, correlation, leveraging network monitoring and host-based logging, and those kind of things, really building out a lot of these capabilities. It talks briefly about segmentation like ITOT, but it doesn't talk about internal segmentation and what that looks like. It briefly talks about, you know, like Active Directory and knowing your trust boundaries. I really hope that, you know, going forward that we don't have these boundaries, the trust boundaries and there. So really looking at leveraging like 6443, leveraging a lot of the good work that's been done there and including that in the standard moving forward. So the directive, yeah.
Awesome. I think that you hit on a lot of key points, and I like to be able to have focus on what that future could look like for them, because if you're only looking at the here and now and you miss out on that potential future timeline, then you may find yourself completely off course. So along those same lines, Samara, you've got your crystal ball, looking at the plus the 2-3, right? The 2 years, we know we got to deal with these assessment plans. What does it look for that 3 to 5, or maybe even that 10-year vision for folks creating their programs now?
Well, there's two things that really come to mind. One is that at that point, there should be a maturity that's there, and it's going beyond just, okay, I need to meet at least what's requested of me in the directive, and really stepping back to say, okay, what should my program be, and what should it look like? What should it incorporate to have a more comprehensive program? Because the directive really is putting forth a minimum, right? I think the other thing that I call out is across industry, we're going through, you know, tech modernization. It's not happening overnight, but it is happening, right? And so it presents an opportunity to really lean in and try to, you know, I guess, build security in, but also really think about the technology that could help prepare us, not just for the challenges we know we face today, and some of the common security domains and objectives we've always had to address, but then how can we do that more efficiently and more effectively in the future? And so I'm really hopeful that we can ride this modernization wave that the business is on for a number of different drivers, right, to also help increase our security.
I love that. It's one of the things that we actually, I wrote a course with SANS called ICS 418 for managers. And it's one of the things that we talk about is digitalization, digital transformation is coming. Just like we used to talk about convergence, like for the longest time we said convergence is coming, and now if you say that, you're already too late. Convergence is here. But the digital transformation is coming, and it's for the first time ever that I've started seeing CISOs get more engaged in that conversation, which means that we actually have the opportunity this time to do it right. If we're there as part of the starting steps of the conversation, then we'll probably be able to make sure that we don't say, as we used to say with convergence, like, no, you can't put TCP/IP inside my plant network. And obviously we won that debate, and therefore there's no TCP/IP anywhere inside our plant networks, right? No, we lost that debate. But I'm finding the conversation shifting for digital transformation now to be yes, but, and that's a better place to be. Yes, we can do this, but here's how we have to secure it. And I think that if we're doing that, that's a really great vision statement there, Samara, to be able to end on, is be a part of the business conversation, understand that the business conversation is going to shape your security program and your compliance program now that you have to worry about that. So I'd like to be able to share sort of these final slides of resources for everybody. I'd like to be able to thank both of our awesome panelists to be able to have this conversation. I hope it was insightful for everybody. I hope that you're able to, again, get the multiple viewpoints. And this is one of the things I got really excited about when I saw this panel being sort of created is, oh, I know both of their backgrounds, and I know that we could have a really great dialogue and dive into things that maybe you're not going to hear in sort of a typical rundown of requirements, but instead talk about the things that could really matter to you. So thank you for joining us both from the Drago side and the Amazon Web Services energy side. Love to be able to see you on future presentations. But for those of you who still have questions, again, we will be able to answer those. I'll be able to get email out via the people who registered and get you some of the context that you'd like to be able to get out of this and future webinars. So with that, Mike, Samara, thank you so much. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.